viewers, or sorry, not viewers. Hello, listeners. Welcome to How Did You Get That? We are your hosts, Alexandra Phil, and
Andrew Sutherland. Um, we're still
you want to
trying to
introduce
figure out
yourself?
how to. Yeah, no. Hi, I'm Andrew Sutherland. I am a grad student who focuses on studying media literacy.
Mhm. And I am a former graduate student. I graduated last May, who also studied media literacy and science communication.
Yes.
And so we've already recorded an episode about Sesame Street and self-efficacy that I highly recommend listening to. But for this episode, I wanted to do something a little different. We're still figuring out our formula, but recently I had a movie viewing experience that has really influenced me and has made me want to spread the good word to every single person I have ever met in my life. So Andrew has been kind enough to allow me the space to talk about this movie. And so the movie we are going to talk about today is The Wild Robot. Andrew, would you mind giving a brief summary about this
Yeah.
movie?
Yeah. Based on the 2016 novel of the same name, The Wild Robot stars Rosman Unit 7134, or better known as Roz, as they crash on an uninhabited island. As they try to navigate the island, they take moments to try to learn about their environment, to better
Mhm.
able to fulfill their function of helping people. They learn about basically how the animals speak on this island and eventually is able to communicate with them. But in a
Mhm.
moment, they ultimately, while being chased by a bear, a grizzly bear, voiced by Mark Hamill, I must add, they
Mhm.
accidentally crush a goose's nest, killing the bird as well as the majority of the eggs, except for one. Uh, During that time, the robot, once the egg hatches, they basically take on a motherly role and raise the gooseling known as Bright Bill. And basically, the movie is all about kind of like this ability, this moment of growth for Roz to ultimately learn and teach others to fill its function. But as time goes by, Roz starts to feel more fulfillment and basically counteracts its programming. It doesn't just want to be done with its one task of raising this little goose to be able to swim, eat, and fly, but it starts to take on a more expansive understanding of who they are.
I think that's a great description. And I'm curious, what were your feelings or your expectations when you first went to see the movie, and how do you think that compares to what you actually experienced when you walked out?
So we ended up just watching it on YouTube. Uh,
Nice.
but like I originally was because my fiance, she straight up told me that she read this book, the original
Mhm.
book to her kids. She used to teach third grade, and she told me
Mhm.
she read it, and I'm like, okay, so it's a kids movie. And then within like the first like act, we literally see a bunch of animals rip a bird's head off, and I'm just like, oh. Oh, this is not what I'm expecting.
That was that part did not resonate with me, not
They,
impact me as much, which is
they,
a
th
fun lesson about how media impacts people differently. Mhm.
there's literally a scene where they make a point about like it's literally about the environment. It's literally about like, okay, this is nature. We're talking to a mother of like seven kids, a possum, and then like, oh, she's like, oh, I have seven kids, and then you hear a scream in the background. It's like, oh, I have six, and then the kid comes back. It's like, don't worry, I'm still alive. Oh my goodness, that was a lot.
Yes, I was dying during that scene. I thought that was hilarious. Um,
Just like the
so
possums, they taught you how to properly die, right? Bleh.
they did. They did. So one of the things that I really liked about this movie, and this is a theme that was expressed in Peter Brown's original book, is that nature, while being very beautiful, is also very ugly at
Yeah.
times. And I would say throughout the book and in the movie, we often see this. I guess, this juxtaposition of the beauty of nature and the wonders of the environment next to the horrors and the fear of what nature can do to us. So, in the story of the wild robot, in the original book, it focuses mostly on Roz's feelings of otherness, then her relationship. I'm using the pronoun her because
They
that seemed most appropriate.
well, they do acknowledge her throughout the movie and book, if I understand.
Okay, then we'll say her. Um, so it focuses a lot on Roz's journey, first with arriving to this island, trying to understand the animals there because she's not equipped to be a wild robot at first. But then through the loving relationship that she forms with this gosling, she learns more about herself as well as the inhabitants of this island. And so what I found really interesting was after watching this movie, I did a little bit of digging, and a few details that I think are worth knowing is one, it was directed by Chris Sanders, who most of you will probably know for his other movie, Lilo and Stitch. He's
Yes.
worked on quite a few films, but Lilo and Stitch, I think, is by far one of the best movies he's ever made and was ever made.
It's literally my fiance's favorite movie.
Is it?
Yeah, it is.
I hope it was replaced with the wild robot. Actually, no. They're two very different stories, and they're both wonderful. So Chris Sanders, I think, already has a sophisticated understanding of the the importance of family as well as the delicacy of family and how those bonds are forged. So going into this movie, you would mostly expect to watch a film about like the beauty and also ugliness of nature. You'd expect a cute family story, and you'd expect a lot of action with birds. But something else that was included in this film that I was really stunned by were the very subtle environmental and climate change messages that were incorporated throughout the movie. There's a specific scene that I'm thinking of, Andrew, and I wonder if you can think of the scene that I'm thinking of, um, that says that the world the wild robot takes place in, not necessarily in the book, but certainly in the movie, is very different than the world we live in now.
I feel like I pointed this out maybe
Mhm.
during my first viewing, but I think it's taking place in the future, and the scene you're thinking about is when the geese are flying, migrating, and we see the Golden Gate Bridge completely, or
Mhm.
the majority of it completely submerged.
Yes. Yes, that was a moment that it stunned me. And I really liked it because there was never a conversation between the characters of, oh, the world is so different now that climate change has melted all of the glaciers and certain areas of the planet are uninhabitable.
Yeah.
Um, those conversations didn't take place, but what we saw in this movie is we saw a lot of beautiful scenes of wilderness, and the few scenes that we saw of the animals interacting with the remains of humanity. Clearly, humanity has evolved. They are no longer able to live in certain parts of the wilderness. The planet has changed drastically, and now humans are living in these very cool, I might add, Jetson style futuristic cities,
Which makes
which
me
I
think.
I really enjoyed. It was both a warning. I thought the way that it was framed, it was both a warning of what could happen if we don't take care of our planet, but also a positive perception of what the future could look like.
I would like to make the point that the Jetsons
Yes.
take place in the year 2062.
It's a good point. I'm mostly used to the Harvey Birdman Attorney at Law episode where they take place in the year 2002 and they travel back in time to the year 2004 to sue humanity. I love that show. So, anyway, I really loved the environmental themes that were present throughout this movie, and I liked how the creators of this film imagined the world of the wild robot as one where the planet has changed drastically. And so we do get that one shot of the Golden Gate Bridge that I thought was so impactful. But there were other moments in this movie that spoke about the changing environment. Andrew, were there any moments in the movie that you can think of that
Well, I can't remember all the places that they were alluding to, like, hey, this is submerged, this is completely destroyed. But I think the
mhm,
other big part was the winter scene. They made the
mhm,
point that this is the most extreme winter that we've experienced. And
yes.
yeah, and that's something that I was thinking about.
hmm Oh, I thought that was a great moment. They used a severe weather event, which are going to become more prevalent with climate change. They used a severe weather event for storytelling purposes. And there was never an assignment of blame. They never said, oh, gosh darn humans causing this severe weather event. There was nothing like that. But they made it clear that this horrible storm, unlike storms in the past, was making life on the island almost completely uninhabitable. Um, and then proceeds, I mean, a beautiful scene in which Roz bravely, um, you know, goes through this storm trying to rescue every single life that she can. And
Hmm.
she's not always successful.
No, who is it? What's the fox's name? Think?
Think,
Voiced
yes.
by Pedro Pascal. Um,
Hmm
yes, absolutely. Literally makes a point. Like one, the first time is a joke. Oh no, this one's dead because it's a animal that Fink doesn't like, the skunk. But then later on, they point out like, oh, this one didn't make it, and Fink makes the point. It's okay. Yeah,
Yeah. It's really sad, but it's I think handled quite subtly and so well because for any young children who are watching it, they would probably just understand it as Ross looked into a hole and did not find what she needed.
hmm
Whereas me as an adult watching it, I knew immediately what it meant when she was unable to bring another life back to her home. And so I was so impressed with all of this storytelling because these themes really did they set the scene for or they set the yeah they set the created a sense of setting for this movie, which really was about the relationship she had with her adopted son Brightbill. But they created such a real world that such a sorry, I'm having trouble describing this. It did create a very real world that I thought we could potentially see. It made me feel very mindful about the future that we're currently walking into.
very
Um,
demure. Very
very
demure.
demure.
Yeah.
Yes, made me feel very demure, very mindful. So one thing that I wanted to bring up, or something that I thought would be worth mentioning, is afterwards when I was researching this movie, I was curious about the production process. I knew that it was based on a book, which I later got a copy of the book from the library. Shout out to the Libby app. Got a copy of the book and I read it. Um, And I also wanted to know more just about the process of putting this film together because I think DreamWorks, the studio behind this movie, is creating some really incredible um, films at the moment. I think they're really pushing the envelope in terms of storytelling. Their earlier film, Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, I thought was just masterfully
It was
done.
fun.
That was a good movie, right?
Yeah.
It was so good. And so something else that happened that I thought was really interesting was if you go to the Wikipedia page, actually, they'll describe this. Um, but the movie's environmental themes were not there on accident, but they were actually placed there on purpose by the Natural Resource Defense Council's Rewrite the Future initiative. And so, for those who are unfamiliar, Rewrite the Future is I'm restating this. It is an initiative from the Natural Resource Defense Council that is trying to change how we present climate change in storytelling. And there's a legitimate reason for this. So, back in, I want to say, I had trouble finding the study, but Andrew, I'll send it to you later. I want to say in 2022, a study was conducted that took a look at all of the major television on that was like that people were watching. And it found that only about 3% of these shows mentioned climate change within their show in any capacity. One
Like in a direct way?
in a direct way.
Okay, yeah, where with the
Mhm.
wild robot, I would say it's more indirect.
I would say pretty indirect until we get to that shot with the Golden Gate Bridge
Well,
under submerged.
well, it's not directly saying that it's due to climate change. It
They
could have
never
been
say
just
it.
like a giant beaver dam fell apart.
Right. If Beaver Dam is code for all of the icebergs melting
Yeah,
because of human
yeah,
activity.
but they're not directly saying this was caused by
Mhm.
climate change. It's saying, okay, there's this massive event that flooded this area, and we basically put the pieces together. That's what I mean by
Sure.
indirect.
Okay, I think that's fair. So I going back to this study that I think is very much worth reading, and I was trying to bring it up earlier because yes, it's called a glaring absence. Um, and it was created by the USC Norman Lear Center Media Impact Project. What they were doing was they were looking at all of the examples of climate change brought up in any capacity in media. And they found that it really wasn't brought up at all. Very rarely was climate change mentioned in any kind of international TV, in film, in streaming. That despite the fact that climate change is one of those issues that's really impacting modern life. And I mean, to the point where if you talk to almost any child on some level, they're aware of climate change. This is a pressing issue that has a lot of awareness, but the fact that it's not represented in our media is surprising. And so there are other ways that you can talk about climate change without being overt about it, right? You can talk about severe weather events. You can say, oh gosh, it sure is getting hot, or you can show an image of the Golden Gate Bridge completely submerged in water. But I think what's interesting is that Rewrite the Future is just one of many initiatives that is understanding the importance of representing climate change within storytelling and how that can impact the audience. But that's also my way of saying is that this movie, while it was created with the intention of entertaining and delighting delighting young audiences and bringing to life Peter Brown's story, it also had the intention of informing the audience and reminding them about this looming event. All right, Andrew, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so the first thing, absolutely, I fully agree with
Mhm.
that. And this is where we can actually talk about like the value, the difference between media literacy and literacy itself. When we, in our last episode, we talk about like the general themes of media literacy of to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and act. But when
Mhm.
it comes to media literacy, it's very similar to literacy. Hi, this is future Andrew, who is in the middle of editing this episode of How Did You Get That? I want to make a correction and offer a citation. I am about to give an explanation of the difference between literacy and media literacy. And I use an example that is used by another content creator. His on TikTok goes by Drew X Deficit. He is a actual educator who teaches media literacy and uses graphic novels to teach these concepts of around media literacy. And I remember watching that video, and I use this example that he gives in one of his videos. So I need to give credit where credit is due. It completely slipped my mind in the middle of the episode. But I'm going to cite at the top of our citation page his video and his TikTok account to ultimately give him credit where credit is due. All right, thank you. Back to the episode. Bye. Literacy is more about like understanding text and reading and identifying themes. But when we add the idea of media literacy, it grants us the deeper understanding of the impact of the source. Who is producing this content? What is their motivations or intent? Um, and that's a big thing about media literacy. So you pointing out what's the initiative called again?
Rewrite the future.
Rewrite the future, adding and
Mhm,
expanding the original text, we have to take that into consideration. And the best way I always think about like media literacy versus literacy is thinking about like different types of media. The perfect who I always think about is first The Lord of the Rings.
mhm,
Um, does it matter that Tolkien was bitten by a spider when he was a child? That could have been an inspiration for Shelob, the great spider of Mirkwood, but it
mhm,
might not really have that big of an influence. However, thinking about Tolkien's military experience, that could be a very
mhm,
inspirational component for various characters. Specifically, I think about Samwise, where you could ultimately, when we think about like heroes of the military, you think about the generals and the leaders. But Tolkien has been quoted in pointing out the people who make the biggest difference within the military are those who are on the field, those who are in the combat. And Samwise, if
mhm,
we think about his experiences within The Lord of the Rings, he is a major figure. And in all honesty, I don't think they would have destroyed the Great Ring, the One Ring, uh,
mhm.
or Sauron without, well, Samwise basically knocking some sense into Frodo.
No, the story would not happen without Samwise, which shows just how impactful Tolkien's military experience was.
Yeah.
Um,
And then
and
another,
so mhm,
oh, go on. You go on.
I was just going to say, though, whenever I talk to someone about their interpretation of Samwise, you can tell they do not understand Tolkien's military history because their immediate response is, oh, Samwise just wanted to get with Frodo.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
Elijah
I mean, poor
Wood,
kid. He is a cutie. And
those
it's
feet.
okay if that's it's okay if that's one reading of the story, but I think it sort of undermines the impact of Tolkien's experience and why he felt like it was so necessary to represent that, as well as at the end of the book, at the end of Return of the King, for instance, he spends quite a bit of the story talking about the damage that has been inflicted on the Shire in the Hobbit's absence. And that was something that surprised me when I was reading the book versus watching the movies. I don't consider myself a big Tolkien fan, but I do remember that. And I thought that was an important part of the books that should have made their way to the films
Yeah.
because it says so much about the impact that that serving in the military during World War II had on Tolkien, that coming home, which should have been a beautiful event, was actually a battle in itself.
Yeah. Another example could be the Watchmen's author, Alan Moore. Did you know Alan Moore is an anarchist? Like
Not
like
until you told me.
yeah. With that understanding, it ultimately creates a deeper understanding of various characters within his comics and the themes that emerge. In particular, you can think of the comedian who is not only a sexist, misogynist scumbag, but also kind of represents like the worst in like people who have power within a system, where he uses his access to power to do harm. And then you
Yes.
have Rorschach, who has no real power, but he imposes violence on people who do not fit within his moral view. And both of those characters are kind of critiques of right-wing politics or extreme right-wing politics in many ways.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so
No,
taking
that's
that,
mhm.
yeah, and taking into consideration the author, Alan Moore's experiences and personal views, it ultimately gives us a deeper understanding of the text, hence why
Mhm.
it's media literacy.
Yeah, thank you for that explanation. And so, if I'm taking pauses, it's because I'm really trying to collect my thoughts on this one because, like I said, this movie impacted me. While I was watching it, there were so many moments where I could literally feel my heart swelling with the music, where I was sobbing over a little robot and this
Oh, I
tiny little
cried.
gosling.
I
Oh my
cried.
gosh.
I was bawling the moment like Bright Bill started flying away, and I'm like, ah, ah.
Oh my gosh. When Roz gives Bright Bill a boost because he's finally able to make it with the rest of the herd when he can fly off with them, but he just wants her there with him one last time. Oh my gosh.
And then when Roz, like near the end, spoiler, when Roz basically saves Bright Bill
Hmm.
by ripping
Yeah.
out basically her heart or whatever it is,
Hmm.
which I do have a critique. Once they like, okay, they're still walking around, they're still functioning after they ripped it out. I'm like, okay, then was it really that impactful? But it still made me cry.
Exactly. I don't understand what happened. And I that is
I think
when
that's
logic sort of fell apart
because,
for me.
well, it's also I think it's because like, and it's alluded to that they function because of like solar power, their solar power units, but I
Hmm.
don't know.
Right. That is something I'm going to have to rewatch the movie for. Oh no. I'm
Uh,
devastated. But overall, I was deeply impacted by this movie, and I'm still thinking about it. And I don't know what the exact intentions of the creators are. Aside, I don't think their intention in that I don't think their intentions were, I hope to make this former graduate student cry in a movie theater.
eh.
But I do think they were trying to pay homage to this deeply emotional work while also elevating it. And this is, I mean, no disrespect to Peter Brown because I did read his book and I did enjoy it. But I didn't quite have the same emotional reaction that I did when I watched The Wild Robot. Um, and, reading a book and watching a movie, completely different experiences, especially when you can tell that the movie is crafted with a lot of love and a lot of respect for the source material, as well as with their own artistic vision. There was clearly a lot of independent creatives who were working on this movie um, who had a goal to create something beautiful, and I really admire that. Um, and so, what I'm trying to say is that there were many different people were involved in the creation of this movie and the final product that we saw. There was first Peter Brown, who had to envision the story. Then we had Chris Sanders and his work on the story, followed by Andrew and myself, how we watched it and how we interpreted it. And so that is an essential part of media literacy, is understanding the thoughts behind the creation of this movie, as well as how we interpreted it ourselves. And I can say how I interpreted it was I thought this was a beautiful story that subtly references the horrors of climate change and extreme weather events, but not in a way that made me frightened to continue the fight. So, and thank you for letting me share my thoughts, Andrew.
No, I mean, like, this is your episode. You guide the conversation. Absolutely. Um, I think we
Thank
also
you.
have, yeah, no, I really enjoyed the movie. I I didn't notice the climate change themes until like when the migration scene happened. But it
Mhm.
also fulfills like world building and getting people to
Mhm.
ultimately make connections to the film and or the text or it wasn't no, they don't mention that in the book, but granted I did not read the book. But I asked my fiance, "What do you remember from reading the book?" And she told me everything.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's okay. I think in the other books, Brown does go into more detail about the world that they're in. Um, but that's the thing, film occasionally has the ability to elevate source material, occasionally when they take their visuals seriously.
Hmm.
And I think this is an example of a film that really used its visuals in addition to the written story to to touch on multiple themes.
And One of those other themes I think we have to kind of mention is well, first I could bring up, like in the case of media literacy, kind of one of the big themes associated that we can think about is social cognitive theory, learning through observation,
Mhm.
where Roz at the beginning needs to learn about their environment, and she ultimately basically takes time, observes the environment, and learns the language of the animals. But we also learn through observation, through for Brightbill. When they're learning how to fly, when they're learning how to swim, they're observing video that
Mhm.
Roz procured for them, but also they learn through observing other geese who don't really want to do anything with them. And that goes into the big theme of otherization. So yeah, one of the other big themes is otherization, where we see literally at once Roz is able to learn the language of the animals, they start to be ostracized. They start to be separated from the pack in certain ways or not accepted. And we see that similarly with Brightbill, who is raised by Roz and looked
Mhm.
as an other throughout the film. And I
Mhm.
think and I think we have to have kind of an idea of like identification to better understand otherization. According to Burke in 1969, identification is fundamental to being human, or in this case, animal, and allows individuals to identify differences between themselves and others. Through identification, individuals relate their values, beliefs, and attitudes and compare it to those who do not. Burke argues that identification can be useful as a persuasive tool, where audiences produce acceptances to stance based on their personal perceptions and how they perceive their worldview, their status, their beliefs as more considered good or divine, and relate themselves with an inherent other, or other words, separating themselves from those who do not have those similar beliefs. Thus, identification implies division and therefore as a function of language that must be analyzed kind of together. And so what we see is as time goes by, Roz is overall rejected, but as they start to ultimately interact with other animals more and more, they start to become more accepted. And that big winter scene ultimately leads to
Mhm.
that moment. And then the animal starts to accept them. And when we think about media literacy, we can also like apply this to a variety of different circumstances and concepts. In the case of Stance and Shalom in 2021, they ultimately explored audiences' perceptions of narratives or television narratives that focus on uh, black portrayals. And ultimately, scripted television is ultimately positively related to favorability of parasocial relationships, or the idea that I, as an audience member, feel connected or feel like I'm interacting with the characters on a screen through a one way relationship. These
Mhm.
positive parasocial relationships with black television characters were associated with increased support for social justice issues, particularly among viewers lacking interpersonal contact with black individuals. Another example of this could come about with experiences too. One of my favorite articles of all time, and I hope we can do an episode about this, is parasocial relationships or parasocial interaction with
Ooh.
improving acceptance towards mental health. In particular, Hoffner and Cohen, Elizabeth Cohen was one of my mentors in my master's program, studied the TV show Monk and found that basically people who don't experience OCD were more likely to better understand the experience and better were more accepting through this parasocial interaction through watching Monk.
That's fascinating. It reminds me of a similar study that I unfortunately do not have the background for. I don't have the annotation for, but hopefully we can find it later about the impact of the transgender character in Orange is the New Black. For a lot of audiences, that was the first time they'd been exposed to a transgender character, and the reaction was surprisingly positive.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
that's a big thing that we need to recognize. And in the case of media literacy and kind of preventing or reducing the effects of otherization, media literacy can serve as an influence to um, making people feel like they're more closer together, but also kind of reduce the effects of stereotypes. Um, qual Our quantitative research on the effects of media literacy training and mediating counter stereotypes have been found to reduce perceptions around stereotypes, as found in Cheryl and Rasabrama. Very long names, and I know I butchered them. Research records revealed that although the topic is severely misunderstood, media literacy education holds great promise for its ability to shape media-related knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors, and encourages an active approach to engaging with media. So in that sense, when I was thinking about watching the film and thinking about like
Mhm.
the idea of the theme of otherization, I kind of was thinking about like, well, media literacy. If we start thinking about what is the media we're engaging with, what are the themes that we're identifying, and how does this we can relate it to our personal lives? We can recognize like, okay, this is kind of like also a narrative about like why otherization is bad.
That's a really interesting way of putting it because, yes, the way this movie is framed, you very much identify with Roz's character, and you do feel that alienation that she feels. You do feel othered as she does, which is quite an impressive feat for a character that's a robot and isn't supposed to have any feelings at all.
Yeah, and then they reprogram themselves so they can
Mhm.
feel something.
They can. They become more than their programming, more than their
Ah,
conditioning.
yes, yes.
Do you see what I did? Do you
I
see what I
did.
just did there?
I
Do
did
you,
see what it's brilliant. Very brilliant.
yeah, oh my gosh, I just did a thing. It was pretty cool. Yeah, no, I'm sure the audience will really appreciate it. So those were those were my main thoughts on the movie The Wild Robot. Um, I really loved it, and I cannot wait for the sequel. But Andrew, did you have any other thoughts that you wanted to share?
They're making a sequel?
Sequel's been greenlit.
I'm gonna be honest, I don't think there needs to be a sequel. I don't know was there a sequel to the book?
Yes, there is.
Okay, then never
There,
mind.
there's a trilogy.
Oh,
Um, yes, there's a trilogy. So it's not out of nowhere, and it seems like it would take a long time for the sequel to be developed. At least I believe this movie took at least 4 years.
oh
Um,
goodness.
so yeah, animated films. I mean, quite frankly, they don't get nearly enough respect for the massive amounts of work that go into them. Um, but yeah, this movie took a long time to make.
Okay.
And so I
Well,
can't wait for them to take a very long time to make the next one.
yeah, no, no, absolutely. Fully agree. The only other thought, and this is more
Mhm.
like made me chuckle, is that Matthew Barry voices Paddles the
Yes.
beaver,
Yes.
which to me is a double entendre. You didn't think of that, did you?
I did not, but it's a really good. That's a really. I mean, I was already thinking that this movie was perfectly cast. Um,
Oh, Matthew Barry is a
oh,
beaver.
oh my gosh, he was so grumpy, but it was perfect for the role.
I
Um,
really wanted him to do more Matthew Barryisms like he does in What We Do in the Shadows. I could
I
not
think. Mhm.
I could not. I wanted him to say like, "You're the most devious bastard in New York City." Just doing stuff like that would have been. I loved it. I think, yeah.
Mhm. I think tragically, they probably did put a little bit of a leash on him because they're
Ah,
like, Matthew Barry, you are allowed to chew up this much of the screenery,
like
this
wood.
much seed. Yeah, you can chew up this much. Um, But I mean, the moments where he was there, he shone.
Yes. Uh,
Hmm. Yeah.
like
So I mean,
Annalicia's the first thing we do every time we watch certain types of movies like this is like, who is that voice actor? So like with uh it's Puck, right? The fox? Or
the
Fink, it's
fox
Fink, it's
is
Fink.
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 Yeah.
We both were like, okay, who's that? Who's that? His voice sounds familiar. And I look it up and then I'm like,
Mhm.
okay, uh, this man is, and I give descriptions. She's like, Pedro Pascal. And
Ah,
then,
that's fun.
yes.
I
And
love that.
then, yeah. And then when we first heard uh, Paddles, we were like, oh, that's Matthew Barry.
He has such a distinctive voice. I'll say the actor who I did not recognize is Mark Hamill.
Yeah, no,
All right.
when,
Mhm.
which the only time we did hear him, the first time we hear him is actually at kind of the climax of the movie where they have
Mhm.
the whole like winter scene. And the moment
Right.
I heard that, I'm like, oh, it's a grizzly voice. It kind of sounds like Mark Hamill, and then I look and I'm like, oh, it's Mark Hamill.
Didn't even recognize him. But I mean that with like as a compliment because I really enjoy Mark Hamill's voice acting, and so every time I learn that he's in something, for me, that's it's just such a treat.
Yep. And then you had Catherine O'Hare as the possums
Oh,
or the
and
possum.
nailed it. She's wonderful.
Yes.
No notes. Lupita Nyong'o was, oh my gosh, lovely, perfection as always. Um, and Kit Connor, Bright Bill, did a wonderful job.
Very wonderful.
Oh, he it just so much heart in this role. He played this this orphaned, the orphan goose. He played this strange child so well with so much love. Um, yeah, it was really, really a delight. I think he did wonderfully. So honestly, like hats off to all of the characters and all of the actors who were in this movie.
Perfect. So, with that in mind, do you have any types of advice that you think we could apply to
Mm.
this movie for the audience?
My advice would be that the presence of a message in a film isn't a bad thing.
No.
And so if you feel like the filmmaker is trying to tell you something, it may be worth looking into it,
Yeah.
seeing what they're trying to say.
You don't want to be,
Otherwise,
yeah, you don't want to be a passive audience member. You don't just want to watch and be like, oh, they're trying to preach something. Dive deeper into the film, understand what their message is, look up the evidence, the data, uh, expand your sources.
it's, I can say for myself, it will not take away from the magic of the
No,
movie. If anything, it'll give you a deeper appreciation for the amount of incredibly hard work that goes into creating this wonderful artwork that we all get to enjoy.
exactly. All right. Um, if there's no other thoughts, I think we should
I'm good.
start to wrap things up. Thank you
Mhm.
for listening to our second episode of How Did You Find Get That? How Did You Get That podcast?
How did you get that?
A podcast all about media literacy and pop culture.
Mhm.
As always, check your sources, uh, dive deeper into the content, have some fun, and read the Happy Hagfish podcast or blog. And with that in mind, to quote Edward R. Murrow, good night and good luck.